I'm going to start. I don't see Gordon yet, but I think we'll just get going and see if he jumps in. So welcome. This is one of the three panels that preview the LERA annual research volume. This is the last of the three. As Todd said, we're recording this. If you want to go off the record, just let me know and I'll pause it and then go back on the record. I think we'll go in the order of the program, which is Todd Rutherford of the Maxwell School at Syracuse, then Gordon Lafer of the Labor Education and Research Center at Oregon, and then Michelle Van Noy, Heather McKay, and Alysa Hannon of the School of Management and Labor at Rutgers. And then the discussant is Adam Seth Litwin from the ILR School at Cornell. So what I proposed ahead of time is that each of the presenters would take about 12 minutes or no more than 12 minutes. Then the discussant would have about 12 minutes, and then the authors would have a brief opportunity for response. That's not going to leave much time for questions. So if we don't get to questions, or if we don't get to all of the questions, please put your questions in the chat box. I will save that and I will send those to the authors and ask them to respond to the person who posed the question. I think that's about it. So without further ado, Todd Rutherford.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm just going to put my presentation up. So, and share. Okay, so is everyone seeing that?
Yep.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so this paper is actually based on mostly on a review of secondary research, but I actually have started, whoops, let me get back here again. I have started an empirical project associated with this, doing some work in Italy last year, but I'm also going to work with some Canadian and US and European colleagues on a broader project. But today is really more just a review of some of the issues that we're going to look at in more detail. So it's really about this paradigm, so-called Industry 4.0. I want to talk a little bit about that. I think if you don't already know about it, it's principally around digitally integrated technologies, including robotics, virtual reality, augmented reality, and so forth. So one of the critiques of a lot of the mainstream work on this is that it's very technologically deterministic. It doesn't really look at the role of workers in unions, and if not totally hostile to even their role in it. Yet it's pretty clear that that this technology is really at a very early stage, and in fact, it has a very high level of failure rate. It's estimated that 84% of US digitalization projects actually fail. And as McKinsey reported a couple of years ago, that most of these projects actually haven't even scaled up to a level of value producing, so that they're in a kind of pilot purgatory. So there has been some sense in which worker influence might actually be really important, that technologies are not simply determined by their materiality, but in fact, at this experimental stage, there's been some consideration that they have some role to play in this. And so we have different scenarios being played out, mostly in the research in Europe, of a specialization, upskilling one trajectory versus a more automation, displacing of skill, displacing of worker scenario. And so that these are all possibilities, and of course, all possibilities in between the two scenarios as well. So the United States is lagged a little bit behind in terms of discussion of Industry 4.0, but there has been some work that the union, especially UAW, has been doing, sort of, again, wanting that more higher skill possibilities coming out of Industry 4.0. So their statement last year was talked about the role of collective bargaining, have a greater say over the technology upskilling of workers. And indeed, GM and some of the manufacturers have also reached out to the union in order to try to work through some of the challenges on this technology. So the 2019 contract established a national committee on advanced technology, and precisely to try to deal with some of these experimental and problematic natures of the technologies. But at the same time, there's real tensions in the union in the sense that the Ford Agreement last year agreed to enhance digital surveillance and mapping of worker movements, so very much a kind of neo-Taylorism. And the union participating in that, the union's been coming under a lot of fire for making this, this agreement. So when we look at the United States, we have to realize that there's been a more piecemeal adoption of Industry 4.0. So GM calls it more smart manufacturing as opposed to kind of a broader suite or paradigm approach that we see more in the European context. And also it's pretty clear that many firms still view workers through the lens of a Taylorist strategy. And to a certain degree, the union may or may not push back against that. The other issue is that's been connected with this increasing interest is the issue of worker representation. So in 2008-09, in the wake of the bailouts at GM and Fiat Chrysler, we have UAW representatives now on the board of directors of the firm. But there's a real lacking of formal workplace co-determination, and it's often been viewed as an impediment for the adoption of Industry 4.0 and broader issues that workers might be have an interest in. So Kathy Feingold, international director of the AFL-CIO, really talks about this kind of what I call German envy or European envy. If only we had these kinds of rights, then we could shape these things much more directly. But a lot of this literature doesn't actually look at how such institutions really work in Europe. Especially around Industry 4.0, and what lessons can US unions actually learn from this European experience. So in the paper, I actually have a broader exposition on my approach. I'm going to run over this fairly quickly right now, but just basically, I'm a labor geographer who also looks at economic geography, looking at the role of workers as critical agents to scale up between local and national and international scales. And also I engage with economic geography, global production networks, looking at how multinational enterprises both constrain and are shaped by the collective agency of workers. So this kind of multi-scalar approach that geographers take does problematize the more national-centric varieties of capitalism approach, but we would still need to recognize that these national institutions are still really important. So if we're going to say, how do we, if we look at the paper that I have, it's like, how do we understand how Industry 4.0 gets adopted? I think there are three main things that we need to bear in mind is the respective position of a particular factory or plant within global production network value chains, the strategic and associational powers and co-determination laws that workers may or may not have access to, but especially at the workplace scale. How do these representatives actually mobilize such resources and, if possible, scale up these experiments to higher scales? So the German and Italian cases developing partly as a contrast using the so-called varieties of capitalism as a kind of entry point into some of the research. So obviously Germany is the archetype coordinated market economy, has that famous dual system, which I think most people already know more about. It's extensively integrated into especially higher value-added mid-range technologies in global production networks. Italy, on the other hand, as a kind of contrast, so-called Mediterranean variety of capitalism with weak industrial financial complementarities and a relatively decentralized and some people would say lawless industrial relations system. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Italian unions and workers, though, do have a form of works councils, the so-called Rappresentanze Unitaria, Sindicale Unitaria, or RSUs, but they don't have any board level co-determination. But these are very important in terms of collective agreements signed at the sectoral level are not valid unless the RSUs sign off on them. So they do have an important role to play at the workplace and broader industrial relations system in Italy. But Italy has got a very fragmented economy, very small internationalized large firms with a very large share of domestically oriented SMEs. So offering some kind of contrast here. So in the paper, I talk a lot about some of the differences that occur between the German and Italian case. So German unions have been more formally integrated into policy decision-making in Germany around Industry 4.0. Italian unions really have not. Also, German unions have some advantages in that their board level representation allows greater share of value to be retained within Germany in GPNs than in the Italian case. But nonetheless, what's remarkable across a lot of the studies is how similar most of the both the opportunities and challenges the unions are confronting here. So wanting a more specialized, professionalized worker, trying to limit extended working hours, and trying to win the right in some of the Italian cases to negotiate the algorithm, the parameters that go into some of these technologies and surveillances and so forth. Also, a lot of local and regional scale experimentation. So in Germany, there's a Arbeit 2020 develops on some of the earlier initiatives around co-determining technology in North Rhine and Westphalia region. Similarly, in northern Italy, in Bergamo, there's an agreement between unions and local small to medium sized enterprises on workplace participation around new technology, reskilling protocols, and so forth. But also what is really interesting is the degree of very similar problems and challenges. So even in Germany, a lot of resistance from firms and works councils to union intervention over these technologies. So the Bosch and Schmitz-Kebler study, I think very interesting here about these problems that they're confronting, is that often the workplace representatives don't have the technical knowledge to adequately deal with these systems that are coming in. And so IG Metall in particular is having to do a lot of retraining with them, okay. But also this context of a kind of over-decentralization of industrial relations, pirate agreements in Italy, and a delinking of macro-scale wages and productivity, which is actually, the reports are suggesting, is actually suppressing the adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies. Firms don't have a lot of incentive when there is not a wage cost push. So conclusions, lessons to learn. I think German and Italian examples have both positive, but also represent a kind of cautionary tale for US unions. Yes, national institutions matter, but what's really interesting is really the limits that are being placed by these kinds of restructurings. So it's not clear that formal German co-determination powers over technology are in fact greater than in the US, where firms must notify and bargain with unions over the effects of new technology. Now, informally, German unions have acquired and works councils have acquired more powers, but formally speaking, it's not clear that they have. That the works councils have focused much more on personnel issues, not on technology issues. So they're having to kind of retrain a lot around this. We also need to consider what is the role of the value chain. So workplace representatives are more important at higher segments of the value chain, not in lower ones. So Krzyzewski's work on Germany and elsewhere has shown that workplace representation matters more at that higher and more new product and process experimental stage, but not so much in lower stages. So the other issue is that scaling up is important to the board level, but we've also seen that this is German unions and representatives can be drawn in to poor decisions, and worker board representatives have actually been systematically marginalized in the way in which these systems work. So this is no panacea, the way in which it's sometimes painted. Also, we need to recognize that there's still an important role of collective bargaining for better linking wages and productivity, and having a presence of a union and not delinking unions from works councils, which has been some argument in the United States. As some of you know, in the United States, you cannot have a works council without a union. And so my point would be, from the European example, having a union supporting the works council is critical and central. Okay, that's where I'll finish off.
Sorry, thanks very much, Todd. That was great. So I still don't see Gordon. So I think we'll go to Michelle and Alyssa, who are both here. Is that okay?
Yep, that's great. And I'll just, I'll share my slides, but then give Michelle the floor just to introduce the chapter and the presentation. Can you see my slides? Are they up there?
Yeah, they're showing up. It looks like they're at the end. So,
Oh, yes.
So I don't want to spend too much time talking because Alyssa has a lot of great information to share, but it's been a nice collaborative effort where we've kind of been putting our minds together really to think about the role of workforce development. And I think, given the current times that we're in now, I think all the more attention is getting placed to this issue of worker skill development and economic development and workforce development, sort of the economic continue to trouble. And so we were trying to think a little bit more about how to place those sort of policy discussions within a broader framework and think about contextualizing them better. A lot of the work that I and my colleague Heather McKay do really stems from that sort of policy discussion, and that's kind of what we're thinking about with this chapter is really how do we think about sort of being within this policy paradigm? How do we think more broadly about the context and about the way that these policy issues get carried out in a way that elevates the interests of workers and make sure to provide the right protections and make sure that we're doing this in a meaningful way as opposed to just sort of perpetuating the status quo. And I think that's a lot of what we see and what we're trying to think about with this chapter is looking at these policies and looking at how they can be crafted in a way that speaks to these higher issues. We cover a wide span of issues in our research, looking at the role of community colleges, workforce development systems, all these things that play into kind of current public policy issues and examining, how do we actually help workers navigate these issues and look for real meaningful advancement. And a lot of what we're doing is sort of stemmed in really pragmatic on the ground issues and the day-to-day experiences of workers. And so it's been a real pleasure to kind of work with Alyssa as we try and connect sort of these really pragmatic policy issues to higher level kinds of theoretical issues and ways of viewing things. And so today what Alyssa is going to talk about is really kind of a snippet of what we're doing overall in the chapter, which is like trying to tackle this very broad area of workforce development. But Alyssa's really brought a very sharp lens of kind of thinking about kind of how theory can really help illuminate these discussions and these dialogues. And so that's really where we have some work to share today. We still, I'll confess, have a little bit more work to do on our chapter, but I think Alyssa's really helped to advance us in sort of thinking about how to place these discussions in broader context. And I think it's really, really important as we go forward. And this kind of workforce development issues get a lot of attention in the public policy dialogue. How do we think about contextualizing them and placing them within these broader discussions and broader dialogues and make sure that they are really elevating worker interests? So I will stop talking and let Alyssa sort of take over and share with you some of the insights that we've been working on through this chapter.
Great, thanks so much, Michelle. And I just want to at the top here thank both Michelle Van Noy and Heather McKay for the opportunity to work on this with them. I come to my PhD program at Rutgers with 10 years of experience in the workforce development space or adjacent spaces. And so I really value sort of the practitioner-oriented fields and what I think they can lend to theory development. And so just to dive right in here, if the both title of our session as well as the volume at large is sort of trying to navigate what is a future of work framework from the perspective of labor studies. And our sitting with that question, the working title of our chapter is Challenging Neoliberal Workforce Development Policy from Within the Paradigm. And I think it's important to note just out front that sort of acknowledges two things. One, that there are challenges to workforce development, including sort of the neoliberal critique. But at the same time, we think that there's a lot of innovation taking place within that space, and it's important for how we theoretically think about the empowerment of workers. And so for this chapter and this presentation, the question we're really trying to answer is why should the labor studies field, thinking about particularly the audience of LERA, care about workforce development, why you should be looking to that space while constructing a labor studies approach to the future of work. And as Michelle noted, one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind is that the language, the assumptions, the ideas of workforce development, its tactics are right now very much at the center of the future of work discourse elsewhere. And so if labor studies is going to construct its own approach, I think it's important not only that that approach be constructed, but also that it answers some of the core questions and tenets of the current debate and discourse. And so this presentation will sort of do three things. And as Michelle noted, the chapter is really covering a broad policy arena of workforce development. But here we're just going to lay out the challenges of workforce development, a few of them, including the quote unquote neoliberal critique, look at a labor studies future of work framework and how it might map on to workforce development. And then finally, kind of think about workforce development practice at various levels and where we might identify promising lines of innovation. And so I'm going to go through the beginning of this presentation quite quickly. And so I'm happy to come back to it if that's of interest to folks, but I really want to focus on the second piece of it. So just sort of briefly here, some challenges to workforce development. There are many, we highlight three. The first is definitional ambiguity. So what is and what isn't workforce development? And I'm speaking specifically about the US here. And I pulled out there a quote from a paper by Harry Holzer, which defines workforce development job training programs for disadvantaged youth and adults. I think we can think about that definition having two sort of central nodes, audience and parameters on job training programs. So where is the line in the sand between workforce development and the formal educational system? And that sort of leads us into this second challenge, which is not only is there definitional ambiguity, but sort of there's definitional contestation, or on both elements of that definition, there's dispute. Just to give you an example of what we mean by that. So for example, on the topic of audience, from both ends of the spectrum of skill when thinking about workers, there's sort of this call for the expansion of workforce development's focus. And so from the lower skill, lower status end of the spectrum, workforce development is often criticized for being institutional inequity, sort of tracking the market with regard to vocational education. On the other side, and the quote here is actually from LERA's research volume in 2009, which looked exclusively at workforce development in the US, sort of both challenges are wrapped in here. The first being, the quote explicitly asks what the workforce development system is, or questions its existence. And then sort of to speak to the second challenge, it sort of openly contests the audience and says that workforce development should really not just be thinking about economically disadvantaged groups. This slide really just speaks to the systematic implications for that. And I think the overall point here on challenge 2 is that in some ways workforce development scholars and practitioners too are in a way working themselves out of a job. So in thinking about the workforce development space, they might be almost directly asking, should it exist? Should it be integrated into the formal educational system? Or should there be more deep alignment, labor market alignment when we think about the formal educational system? And so this sort of brings us to our third challenge. And just to recap, we have definitional ambiguity, we have definitional contestation, and here we're thinking very specifically about the theoretical challenges to workforce development. And just to note, workforce development certainly takes a lot of its theoretical roots in a neoclassical economics tradition. Think about the language of economists, human capital theory. And so in thinking about or contesting that definition of skill, what I've sort of called here the power-based thesis. And so what I think that really raises is just the question of what is skill, or what does skill represent? And thinking about that from more of a power perspective, skill is seen as a proxy of power dynamics sort of negotiated elsewhere. And this sort of results in two critiques of workforce development that I think represent varying sort of severity. The first is, workforce development is great. It's sort of a temporary Band-Aid. It's practically useful, but theoretically irrelevant. And sort of the more damning is, it's not just theoretically discardable in thinking about the theory, the theoretical building blocks of worker empowerment. It's actually strategically undermining. And so just to put the quote unquote power-based thesis in disciplinary context, we've just highlighted three sort of strains of that here. The first being a political science perspective. So really thinking about power as the balance between different interest groups, just raising in Kathleen Phelan's work on the decline of apprenticeship in the US and sort of the monopoly over training by big employers in the 20th century. The second sort of school here that we've highlighted is the neo-Weberian or social constructionist perspective on power, and certainly that interacts with the political science perspective, but really thinking about power emanating more broadly and from a sociological vantage point. And here we're thinking about occupations as socially demarked and skills as representative of social status as opposed to political power. And the third sort of strain of the power-based thesis that we're highlighting is probably closest to industrial relations and the labor studies field broadly, and that's the labor process theory and work of Harry Braverman. And this is, a rejection of skill as social category, emphasizing the subordination of labor to capital under capitalism and the destruction of our traditional sort of conceit of skill, as Braverman says, speed as skill. And this sort of relegates skill to sort of an administrative decision-making function within the workplace that's the realm of managers and driven by the interests of capital. And so if we think about those critiques in sort of a universal or disciplinary lens, those sort of locate themselves in time and place in the current political climate. And so critics of the hegemony of market ideology might see workforce development insofar as it does take its roots in a lot of ways in neoclassical thinking as an extension of the neoliberal agenda. And because neoliberalism is defined or can be defined quite broadly, it is a macroeconomic reform agenda. We wanted to sort of drill down and think about it in two specific frames. The first being from the perspective of industrial relations, and borrowing here from the work of our chair, and thinking both about it in terms of deregulation and enhanced employer discretion, the latter being really important when we think about workforce development interventions at the level of the firm. And then the second piece here, how does neoliberalism manifest in, specifically in the policy arena of higher education? And so there we're thinking about three market principles: competition, self-reliance, and decentralized decision-making. And so if that's the critique of workforce development, those are its challenges, and the neoliberal critique specifically, what is the case? And so I'll get to the last and most important piece here, which is the issue of skill, but just to lay out some of what we think are the strategic or tactical virtues of thinking more deeply about workforce development. The first is sort of the fragmented institutional architecture. So if we think about challenge one and the definitional ambiguity as being a weakness, that sort of lack of architecture or fragmented architecture is also open landscape upon which to build. And again, speaking specifically about the US. So where you think about the inertia or the resources required to make changes in higher ed and institutions of education, workforce development is really in some ways a blank canvas where we can build with different fundamental relationships grounding that space and different assumptions driving it. The second here is sort of just a nod to inductive practice and the centering of kind of the scholar practitioner and sort of the urgency that workforce development reflects in its focus. And I think that brings us to sort of this tactical advantage number three, or the audience. And that's both a matter of potentially moral urgency, but also theoretical validity, in that the identity of particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, their identities, and women have been left out of theories of class and labor power. And so we think thinking about workforce development insofar as it does focus on these communities is both a matter, of urgency and sort of obligation for the agenda of academia, but also relevant to how we think about and build theory. And then finally here, it's sort of a return to skill as a tool of power. So the point being, ignoring skill does not solve for it. And so in building what we are hoping to do in this chapter, and along with the other authors in this volume, is a labor studies framework for a future of work. And so if you think about the neoliberal assumptions I've laid out, what is the retort or alternative logic embedded in the labor studies framework for the future of work? And I've actually, and I saw Mark Hannon on this call, pulled from the recent reports from the World Bank 2019 report on the changing nature of work, as well as the ILO report, as well as sort of the formal academic response, which really nicely lays out how these discourses sort of manifest in terms of a discourse on skills. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over those, only to say, where we're thinking about competition and the market as sort of driving technology and therefore innovation, progress, efficiency on the labor studies framework. For future of work, we're thinking about technology being shaped by power and people. Similarly, in terms of self-reliance, a collection of individuals with human capital. In terms of a labor studies framework, we're thinking about collective action, collective voice, and collective agency. And third, the decentralized decision-making, sort of representative of the neoliberal paradigm, labor flexibility, labor mobility, enabling, efficiency, innovation, and on the other side, thinking about democratic governance or regulation as a tool to shape technology for the empowerment of workers. And so these are the slides that I said I'm just gonna skip in the interest of time, but I can come back to them. And so finally, this is really, as Michelle said, the bulk of the work in terms of the center and mapping this framework onto workforce development practice. And so where you see we've sort of taken each assumption and the alternative logic representative of the labor studies framework for a future of work, we're thinking about it at a respective level. So just to give you an example in terms of individual firms, if we're thinking about, where market competition drives efficiency or progress, and also not letting technology determine the positioning of workers, sector strategies on the ground have actually been a really useful tool particularly insofar as they've incentivized firms to invest in their regional markets outside of their own individual benefits to that. And this obviously still is limited, by relying on exogenous theory of growth, but we think by using something like a labor studies framework for a future of work, we might be able to replicate and leverage those insights or those practices without being limited by their sort of theoretical parameters. Similarly, in terms of unions and market actors, and I know I'm running up here on my time, so I'll just quickly run through. When we're thinking about self-reliance vis-a-vis collective agency, we think that thinking about some of the conversations that happened in yesterday's panel regarding the volume, the importance of power and the role skill has played historically in wins of the labor movement, and also regional control of the local market. So both of those potentially being useful centerpieces for future plays on power, but remembering their limitations, thinking about social closure, sort of from the occupational competition perspective, as well as a continued reliance on market orientation. And then finally, from the perspective of policy or government funded or directed institutions, this contrast between decentralized decision-making and democratic governance, we're really thinking about regulation as a tool, but understanding that requires buy-in both broadly in terms of the electorate as well as the ecosystem actors of workforce development on the ground. And just to wrap up here, so what this looks like at the first level, because we don't have time to go into all of them, we kind of break down, what is the theoretical tradition at this level of workforce development intervention. So with regard to at the level of firms, certainly the way firms have thought about and think about skills has been influenced by neoclassical economics, the resource-based view of the firm. But there have been really important updates to that literature, the relational view of the firm, cluster theory, that have paved the way and responded to this sector strategy development and industry clusters. And that's something we think we can build on. But there are really important limitations. So firms need to be coordinated. Industry clusters don't work as industry clusters in and of themselves. Workers might benefit from higher average pay, but they also don't necessarily see gains in wage differentials or wage growth, not to mention sort of the regional impacts from a place-based perspective in terms of costs. And fundamentally, sector strategies are still reliant on market ideology. And so just to wrap up, I think that last section there, and then my final quote here is just that as labor studies scholars and people thinking about labor, I think this chapter and what we're hoping to do in it is really make a case that there needs to be a recentering and problematizing of skill. Even if you come from a theoretical tradition where you might see it primarily or exclusively as a tool of power, it needs to be openly confronted and contested. And so I'll end there.
Thanks very much. So I gave Michelle and Alysa a little longer because looks like we only had 2 presentations. So I apologize, Todd, for not giving you longer. If you want another couple of minutes, you'll need to unmute yourself. You'll need to unmute yourself, Todd.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm happy just to continue on, and if there's questions, we can have a discussion, yeah.
Okay. Adam, you're up. Thanks.
All right, so thank you to both Todd and to Alysa, Michelle, and Heather. I think both of these papers have arguments that are really capacious and also generative. They really got me thinking. So first I'll say something about each paper individually, and then I'll say something about the 2 of them and this sort of critique of the future of work a little bit more broadly. So Todd's goal was to distill lessons from American and Canadian unions, rather 4 American unions and Canadian unions from European unions, namely Germany and Italy. Particularly, let's think about workplace representation. And he focuses on institutional support for negotiations around technological change in particular, which makes sense given the volume. So he decided to look specifically at the transition to Industry 4.0. And in this analysis, Germany represents the role of unions in what we would think of as a coordinated market economy. And then Italy is supposed to represent maybe something more akin to a liberal market economy, but Todd labels it a non-CME, which I think is probably a little bit more accurate. A few questions for Todd. One is, you talked about the sort of neo-Taylorist approach that some would argue the UAW is taking toward Industry 4.0. And I don't know, as I think about 2 things. One, the seminal work of, Commons, for example, about how labor organizes around market changes or should organize around market changes. And then also the inherent sort of conservatism to labor organizations. I wonder if it almost kind of makes sense that the UAW has decided to adopt a neo-Tayloristic approach. I mean, they're sort of set up for job control. And so there are kind of two approaches they could take. One is to reorganize themselves and to restructure themselves, which if you think about it, it's a lot harder than just saying, no, why don't we use the structure we have and try to ask capital to apply that, rather to restructure itself so that this can work for us now. I don't know the answer to that question, but I remember, but when you said that, it sort of triggered that in my mind. I was thinking, actually, you know, Taylorism probably works for the UAW. They may not love it, but they're structured in order to sort of process it.
The devil they know.
What? It's
the devil they know.
Yeah, absolutely. So just something to think about. Yeah. Second, I guess and I know you've thought of this, but the real $1 million question, I think, is what are we going to do about labor law in the United States? Because there are sort of two key elements of it, and in particular of the Wagner Act, that we'll either have to maneuver, you know, or just outright change. The first is, as you know, in the wake of 882, managers, they couldn't convene a group of workers to discuss these issues, you know, if they wanted to. In other words, even the most benevolent employers can't establish an institution akin to a works council unless, as you noted, they have a union, and then the union has to be part of that process. And as we know, sadly, in the private sector right now in the US, unionization density is well below 10%. Second, and you prompted this in my mind when you talked about negotiating the algorithm, which I think is so interesting. As you know, technology, it's illegal, but not a mandatory subject for bargaining.
Yes.
Its effects are not. They are legal and a mandatory subject.
That's right. That's right.
Do you think that's why we're kind of in the pickle we're in? Again, it's an obstacle that we kind of need to negotiate, and it's not a simple negotiation, since it could well require altering the Wagner Act, which, you know, probably isn't that much easier than altering the Constitution, right? It's really hard to break that thing open and get approval from and passage from all sides. But still, specifically, I think we can't overstate the importance of labor law, and ours specifically allows bargaining over the effects of technology, but not over the choices themselves.
That's
and
right.
So it seems to me like that's a real limitation that, again, we'll either need to get around intellectually, at least come up with some strategies for maneuverability.
Okay.
In terms of, and we can come back to these questions,
okay,
or
sure.
like
I'll wait.
Earlier, I'm happy if you just take them with you and think about them.
Yep.
Depending on, you know, if we have audience questions. On Alysa, Michelle, and Heather's paper, so here you were asking, why should labor studies as a field care about workforce development, particularly as labor studies itself is trying to construct an approach to the so-called future of work conversation. And so you want to know, what specific unique value does labor studies offer to this discussion? These are super important questions. I'm really glad that such capable people are taking them on. And I'm actually really glad that a PhD student is taking them on, because that means you'll be around, with all good luck, you'll be around for a while to kind of tackle these issues. And I think we're going to need people asking these questions and trying to answer them. So my questions for you, one, how can you get the ear or the eye of those that are trying to undertake more conventional analyses of the future of work? How can you convince them that the issues that you and other labor studies scholars really matter? And, you know, in thinking about this, I tried to put on my kind of neoclassical hat, which is basically, you know, just devil's horns. And I'm trying to figure out, is there a way to just sell this to them as a classic market failure? Because you could say, you know, aside from investing in skill building, you know, you're recognizing a deadweight loss that comes from having idle women, elderly, people of color in the labor market, idle or underutilized people in the labor market, right? So even if we don't necessarily see that as the real motivating force for a labor studies approach to these problems, I have no trouble trying to figure out what people's political motives are and finding some overlap of agreement. But we can make the case, you know, it's not just about investing in these skills, it's about figuring out how to create respect for these jobs. And if you can do that, you can probably write a market failure because you might be able to really permanently increase the pull rate. I'm thinking a lot about some of the jobs I've studied, namely home healthcare workers, which I don't know if some of you may have seen me talk about this when I talk about some of my healthcare work, but these are jobs that like get very little respect. They pay almost nothing, right? They're of the lowest quality, yet perennially people are complaining that there's a shortage of people willing to do this work. And I know when I have to step in and be the neoclassicist to be like, hey, isn't that when wages are supposed to go up? I know there's clearly a problem, right? So it seems to me like we might be able to speak to them in their language, even if it isn't necessarily kind of our real impetus for being interested in this and wanting to help, right? It's about finding points of common ground. Some more broader comments. I think it's very reasonable in these pieces and across the volume to really include a critique of the future of work. Granted, it's like shooting bullets at a wall, right? I mean, there are many issues you can raise with the future of work literature, I think. But I'll sort of lay out some of what I see as the big ones that I certainly think both of these authors could incorporate into their work if they agree with me, and you may not, which would be an interesting turn for the discussion. One is, the future of work is already here. We talk about the future of work like it's in some undefined distant future, but there are already people who are being replaced by machines. I mean, this has been happening for a long time. And now it's hard to find people that are specifically being replaced by AI, but we're certainly seeing people replaced by semi-autonomous robots in service settings. Like that's already happening. And one can imagine that COVID-19 is likely to bring an acceleration in that process and one that lasts. In other words, is it hysteresis when something changes as a result of some external shock like COVID-19? But even when we get over COVID-19, I think a lot of those jobs might be gone for good. It turns out that robots can do a lot of them fairly well. And these companies have already made the big, huge upfront sunk cost into robot investments. So, why bring workers back? A second idea that comes to my mind, and Todd hit this, in the future of work discussion, where's the work? Where are the workers? It seems to me like that's a fundamental contribution that labor studies can make to these conversations. Somehow the future of work conversation seems to me to be very focused on technology. I don't know why we don't call it the future of technology discussion. I mean, it seems to me like that's what they should be calling it, and then we should be having a future of work discussion on our own. But we raised this issue of tech determinism, and it came up in both of these papers. And it seems to me like it tends to characterize a lot of the thinking about the so-called future of work, not just tech determinism, but also something I've heard called techno-chauvinism, which I wish were my neologism, but it's not. Meredith Broussard rather came up with it in a book she wrote recently. But it's the idea that a lot of people who study technology think that deep down in their heart, technology can eventually solve any problem that we put to it. And not only that, but any solution that technology comes up with is objectively a better solution than anyone that could have been developed by a human being. And increasingly, I actually think that employers are going to rely on that thinking, either because they honestly believe it or because they've just been led, or because they don't really question it and they just assume it's truth themselves. So, so these are some issues that I have with the future of work literature in general. I haven't even talked about kind of just what I think of as market determinism too, which is even aside from technological determinism. I guess there's also something that Alysa touched on in her presentation, and this isn't really that much of a newsflash to people like us, but the way we partition tasks into jobs, that's not exogenous, right? Like that's not apolitical. So if I can take off my my neoclassical horns and put on my Marxist hat, or I guess my Marxist, it's probably more of like a Marxist beard. I think what makes us think that employers are simply going to step back and share the power of technologically induced gains with workers just because those workers have invested in the right skills, which might be very rare skills. It's just not obvious to me that employers aren't going to find a way to adjust to that in order to maintain their power in the employment relationship. In fact, I'm quite confident that they will, and they'll do their best to use technology as sort of a cudgel for doing that. Again, either because it genuinely enables them to do things they couldn't do before, or through these techno-chauvinist ideas, it sort of exculpates them from some of the decisions they make that could be unpopular. In general, I think their goal is to really kind of move risk off of themselves and onto workers. I mean, look at ride sharing, right? Like there, the labor, I know they're not employees, right? But the labor, like they're buying the capital, right? Like the capitalist doesn't even have to buy capital. Think about scheduling programs or apps that micromatch worker pay to product or service demand. It used to be that the capitalists took on that risk, but again, it seems like increasingly there are ways and there are eroded norms that allow the capitalists to sort of shift some risk to labor. And I think that that's worth thinking about as well. Having said all that, let me say something now that, and I'll sort of wrap up with this. It might sound like I'm taking some of it back, but I'm not. I'm going back to that point about finding mutual interests. I think that labor studies researchers, I think you need to show some sympathy, whether you mean it or not, to the goals of more mainstream market-oriented scholars and policymakers. Again, not because you believe it, but because you want to get a seat at that table and you want to keep it. And so I'm reminded of that phrase, a journalist named Daniel Shore said it. He said, sincerity is the secret to success. And if you can fake that, you've got it made. Markets, yes, markets, very important indeed, absolutely. But then the other thing I'd say is we really need to try to speak the language and again, show some empathy towards those that study technology itself, because at the moment they have the attention, they may not have the pathos. I think we might have that, but I don't think that they even realize how much power they have. Something I've thought a lot about is technology-centered design versus human-centered design. They still don't really seem to grasp the difference or see a need to move toward human-centered design, or what I actually like to think of as worker-centered design. And that's after they've had, human factors training. So I think that there really is an opportunity for us to contribute to this conversation in a meaningful way, and in a way that isn't disagreeable. Not that either of you have been remotely disagreeable, but I just think we kind of need to play their game. And I don't think that we should feel so awful playing their game if it helps us convey, if it helps us kind of push forward the agenda that we really care about. So those are my comments.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm going to give Todd, Michelle, and Alysa, a little time to respond, and then looks like we will have a few minutes. So maybe if you can use the raise your hand function, since I can't get all of you on the same screen, and I wouldn't necessarily be able to see you, and maybe we can take 2-3 questions. Todd? Okay,
can I just respond very quickly? I think the UAW's strategy right now is still in the making. I think they do want to reverse certain elements of Taylorism where they think that it can advantage them. But I think the decision around the Ford agreement may have also been a power thing, that they felt that they couldn't or would not be able to trade off in the sense of this increased surveillance and so forth. So I agree. I think that there is, the UAW basically organized around Taylorism. And so there is a kind of institutional conservatism here, as I said, is what they're comfortable with at a certain level. But I think that within the documents that I've read, and haven't really had a chance to talk to people there, I sense that they also want a more holistic view of recombination of skill. So I think it's still in the making. There's still Taylorism, there's still other things. As far as the labor law is concerned, it is very interesting, and it is, a lot of people said, if we disengage unions from works councils, then maybe employers will be less resistant to having them. And indeed, we may not know how exactly works councils, even if delinked from unions, might actually work out. Maybe they would become proto-unions, right? We don't know how actors will use those. And in fact, it's probably salutary to remember that co-determination was initially viewed by German unions as a defeat. And yet now it's viewed as something that is very solid part of their system. And unions have basically colonized the works councils. That's pretty clear. There's been some interesting work in the wake of COVID-19. Nelson Lichtenstein, the labor historian, has talked about using health and safety as the wedge in to establish health and safety councils and expand their roles so they become effectively a form of proto-union. And in Canada and some of the other places I've been doing work, health and safety councils, which are often legally mandatory in all workplaces, there's been discussion about expanding their role so they effectively become proto-works councils. And there has been long-term discussion about that. So I'm not necessarily against that. I'm just saying that if we look at Industry 4.0, the kinds of resources, intellectual and otherwise, that unions provide for works councils at that scale seem to be very critical to them actually being able to cope with this. Otherwise, they're having real problems coping with it.
Thanks, Todd. Michelle, Alysa?
I mean, one thing I think I would like to respond to. I definitely agree with the point about trying to find mutual interests and mutual language. I think that's really important to moving the dialogue forward. At the research center where I'm at, we do a lot of work within current policy dialogues and debates. And I do think that there are definitely opportunities to interject and to push on these points. When people are talking about training programs, for example, oftentimes people bring up the issue of job quality. How do we deal with job quality? What do we do with that? People are thinking about these questions and they're asking the hard questions. We work a lot with community colleges. They're very troubled. They're working with a lot of low-income individuals who are coming there to seek advantage, ways to advance, and they're very troubled by all the things that are going on in the labor market that are part of manifesting all these problems that we're talking about. And I think that thinking about ways to work with them and see opportunities to push this dialogue and to partner and to have that common dialogue, I think there is interest, and there are actors in the policy arena who do care and who are open-minded. It's not a monolithic kind of neoliberal imposition. I think there are a lot of people who can be swayed with the right framing and with the right sort of policy options being brought to the table. And so, I think we can come at this from a lot of angles, but I do really appreciate that point that we can find mutual interest and we can find ways to move things forward. And I hope that that's one of the things that we'll be able to contribute in this chapter is to identify those ways that we have this machine operating. What can we do to advance this dialogue? What can we do to promote awareness? And what can we do to advance these questions and these issues and this awareness and help people who generally do care about equality and worker rights and think about ways to give them tools and questions and some policy initiatives that can advance their work. And I think that some of the actors within the education and training system, they can only go so far, and they do need more partnerships with others who can push these issues a little bit further. So I think, community college folks really do care about these issues, but maybe they need to partner with other groups that are advancing these issues more directly. And so I think there's a lot there, and I do really appreciate that comment. And I think that's food for thought that we'll keep pushing forward with.
I'll just add very quickly and briefly to what Michelle just said. I think thanks very much for your comments, Adam. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is just certainly there are opportunities for labor studies folks to, as Michelle noted, play a more amplified role in directing where possible. And I think there's lots of opportunities for that, workforce development intervention and policy making. I think some of the things I'm thinking about, as well as thinking about skill, reconstituting the how we think about skill from a labor studies perspective, the need to do that, and that just sort of writing it off or theoretically marginalizing it by viewing it as a function of power doesn't actually deal with it. And what happens then is that folks coming from that theoretical tradition sort of get marginalized in the conversation where skills is the dominant discourse. And so even if I do ascribe to, we could say skills, that language is neoclassical, problematic, even neoliberal. Okay, well, what is our alternative, or what alternative framework are we putting forward for understanding, whatever it is we might mean by skill in the context of work and worker empowerment? And so I think for me, that's also an ask and sort of an open question for labor studies scholars in the way that they theorize about skill in the context of power.
Thanks. I think that Dion Tola has a question. You want to go ahead?
Thanks, Chris. So first of all, I just want to say that this was such an interesting session, and I'm so sad I missed the first two. So I just want to quickly say congrats to Toby and Todd. I think this is going to be a really exciting volume. I love that there's going to be a volume fully dedicated to the labor studies perspective. My question actually to the panel, to the speakers and the authors of these papers, one of the things, and again, this could be my ignorance of like really understanding labor studies perspective, but because there's such a focus on power, one of the things that I've been long interested in, and Alysa, you kind of know this because I did a talk at Rutgers, in the basic income. So because labor studies scholars kind of always sort of want a shift away from a focus on markets and a focus more on power, why sort of are a lot of the policy prescriptions not sort of also considering things completely outside the labor market that would give workers more power, like for instance, a basic income, where they could actually then sort of have options outside the labor market to be able to, so I'm just wondering, it's not like it's just a question because I never really see it discussed that much in the labor studies perspective. So I'm just wondering why.
Thoughts?
Well, I guess I know certainly in geography, and I guess I need to, preface that I'm more in geography. There is certainly a more of a focus on what we call the reproduction of labor power and empowering the sphere of reproduction, and that would also empower workers as well. So, and coming from some of the more feminist and post-structural contributions. And so there is some overlap there. I think also there is some concern from some of the work that I have seen about, how, in practice, how does the universal basic income work? And does it really end up empowering workers or dividing them? In the sense that, workers conceivably paying tax into a system might also view those not paying as much tax as a drain, and that it would also divide workers as well. So that's been some research I've seen. So while in principle I'm supportive of those kinds of programs, I think we also have to realize that there's also this I hate to say the power dimension again coming back into play, and it might also be divisive amongst workers as well as empowering. So.
Any other responses? So we have a question here. Do you want to ask this question about the role of policy?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I've been just getting used to using the chat during these, but I apologize if I missed this. I was on a bit late, but I just was, as we are talking about the role of different actors and stakeholders in this, I was just curious to hear in particular what folks' thoughts were on what they felt like government needed to be doing more of, especially as we're thinking about impact of COVID. We can debate what the policy response has been thus far, but is there a role, or do we not think that, I mean, there is one, but do we not think that's where we'll see anything, and they'll have to come from other places right now?
So is this specifically around COVID-19 as a response?
Either way, I just threw that out perhaps as a contextual point, but maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I know we're going to see, certainly in the workforce development field, there's going to be a lot of interest coming out of the policy world around worker retraining, in response to the economic crisis that, is occurring and will be occurring. So I mean, I think that this is where it comes to sort of engaging in a meaningful way that is going to be the reality of the discussion moving forward. And the question is how to shape those policies so that they have some kind of meaningful impact, and they also don't distract, I think, from some of the real discussions and real issues that need to be taken into account. So I think, workforce development can be very complex in that way. I think it can actually distract from the real issues. And I think it can also be part of the solution. So I do think policy is going to play a very important role there. And thinking about the kinds of policies that are going to come out and how to shape them in a meaningful way, I think is going to be very important going forward.
Mm-hmm. I think policy always has to be seen as an outcome of how different actors, bring power to play and so forth. So as a general point, I would say, governments will only do what they're forced to do. And yes, they have some autonomy and so forth, but they're also very conservative about what they do. In terms of COVID-19, I think that, there's a recent interesting session in the American Prospect with Ruth Milkman and Nelson Lichtenstein, and talking about that there is this ferment that's been going on amongst American and other workers, not just over COVID-19, but before, but that it's accelerating to a certain degree under the pressures of COVID-19. The challenge is how does that also have a formal outcome, in the sense of, in 08, 09, everyone said, oh, neoliberalism is dead, and there's just all of this is going to change, and if anything, it got doubled down. So similarly, I think in COVID-19 and some of the other challenges we're facing, there's a lot of evidence that workers are not happy with it and they're wanting to resist. But I'm concerned that how do we scale up, I guess, to go back to my geographer roots. And policy is one thing that we need to have, but I think also we can't rely simply on policy. Policy that further empowers workers, yes. Policy that disempowers them or demobilizes them is not something that we want. But policy can't be predicted exactly how that's going to work. But we want power. We want policies that further empower workers, not disempower them.
Thanks, Todd. I think we're out of time, but I just wanted to give Toby and Todd, do you have any sort of comments from the perspective of the volume itself? No?
I just wanted to
go ahead.
No, I just wanted to take a second to thank all of our panelists and contributors for presenting today, and I'm looking forward to reading the papers in greater detail and offering some more feedback at that point. So we'll have time to communicate with the authors more. And thank you, Chris, for chairing, and thank you, Adam, for the wonderful feedback as a discussant.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to everyone, and stay safe out there. I'm going to stop recording now.
You too.